So this morning we are back at it. We are back at the 11 indispensable relationships that you can't live without. We are in week 7 or 8 or 9 or something around that number. And so we're going to be talking this morning about who is your back coverer, who is your Deborah. And so to start that conversation out for us, I wanted to ask who likes football or watches football. You can just put your hand up real quick. I mean, it's okay, you know. We're not going to judge you or anything like that. I've been engaged in a conversation for a while with someone from our congregation, and we're not going to be touching about that too much this morning, but I'm not sure if any of you knew, but this past week marked the 500th day of Deflategate. It marked the 500th day of Deflategate. And so what Deflategate is, it's a scandal that's happened in the NFL. What happened was 2 seasons ago, because we haven't started this season yet. So 2 seasons ago during the AFC Championship game, the New England Patriots were playing the Indianapolis Colts, and it was supposed to be a really tight game. And so in theory, or apparently, the Patriots deflated the footballs below a certain marker, PSI, so that they could grip the ball better and so they could throw it better, apparently. And it was cheating. Apparently, in theory, they cheated. I don't necessarily buy into the entire thing that they did or didn't. I don't really care. But apparently, they cheated. And what has happened is it started this big scandal and many different conversations on Facebook, on different social media outlets. I've had a number of conversations with other people about it, whether it was cheating or not. And so they have gone over 500 days into this Deflategate thing, which personally I think is kind of insane. I just think it's ridiculous that they're still going at it. And what I found to be really shocking is the amount of money that has been spent, estimated that has been spent thus far. They have spent between the NFL, the organization of the NFL, the NFLPA, which is the Players Association, Tom Brady himself, and the New England Patriots themselves, there has been an estimated spend of $22.5 million in research and legal fees up to this point to figure out if Tom Brady deflated footballs, who was involved, and was the NFL justified in handing down a 4-game suspension. And now it's gone through this court and that court and these 3 judges, and they said, one of them said it was okay, and 2 of them said no, and so now they're going on to the next phase, and Tom Brady is kind of throwing out a Hail Mary here to kind of see if he can get this overturned so that he can go play football this season. And it's gone before judge after judge, panel after panel, and it's kind of gone on for a really long time. And so I got to thinking, what's a judge? All these judges that are deciding these things and making these decisions. And so with our conversation this morning, I thought about, okay, so what's a judge? So in our context, a judge is someone who determines or pronounces after an inquiry and deliberation. It's essentially what a judge is, the dictionary term of what a judge is. This judge forms an opinion about something, and after careful thought, now, again, this is the definition, not maybe what we think they do or what they actually do, but after careful thought, they decide what is going on and if someone is good or bad, or they help determine the outcome. Now, we usually think of judges that sit in courtrooms, depending on what time period. They either have, the British, they have those really long, white, curly hairs and stuff like that hang off their head. They sit in a courtroom, they listen to lawyers on either side that make arguments for this person or that person, this entity or that entity, and they make these arguments for their clients. And we've seen this in many TV shows. How many of you have ever watched a TV show that has, a judge and a jury and that whole courtroom scene? I think probably all of us have seen at least 1 or 2. If you've seen any Law and Order since 1980 something or other, they always have some kind of lawyer or DA and a judge, scene in a courtroom. Now, this might be going way back. How many of you remember People's Court or Night Court? Night Court? Night Court? Okay, I've got a few Night Court people out there. Again, you see the judge and you have that whole dynamic going on. There's so many different spin-offs of Law & Order that have judge scenes in it. And then you have what I think are more reality TV shows of Judge Judy and People's Court, things like that, where they have two people screaming at each other about a car and who didn't pay or who paid, and then they start yelling, and they get interviewed outside of the courtroom, who was right, who was wrong. And this is kind of where our mentality is about judges nowadays, it seems like anyways. Now, back in the time period of Deborah, and back in the time period of the judges in Israel, this isn't what they were like. Okay, they were not like this. They didn't dress a certain way and sit on a big chair and have a gavel and bang it. And actually, I should have gotten the gavel that we have. I found one. When I first came, within like a week or two, I went around kind of looking around through things, and I found a gavel. I think it's in the pulpit over there. And I brought it to the first board meeting. And I think some people were kind of surprised that I brought a gavel to the first board meeting. But I just brought it to be funny. Anyways. So the nation of Israel, they didn't have judges like that. They didn't have a gavel. They sat there and banged it. The nation of Israel had gone through, before their judges, a really tough time period. They had just come out of Egypt with Moses. They went through, wandered the desert for a long time, looking for the promised land, found the promised land, and Moses was not allowed to go into it. Joshua led them in, defeated the people, they settled, and then eventually Joshua dies. And here is where the judges come in. And these judges existed between Joshua and Saul. Now, we all remember who Saul is. Saul was the first king of Israel, the first king that they saw all the nations that were around them, and they said, we want to be like all of them. We want a king for ourselves too. We're sick of these judges. We don't want them. We want an earthly king to be with us. And so the judge time period is from Joshua to Saul, kind of smacked in the middle there. It's a really long time period that's kind of in there. It can range between about 500 years or so. I've seen it in between 400 to 550. It kind of depends on where you kind of believe people are kind of lined up. And actually in Judges itself, in the book of Judges, it's not chronological. It's kind of like thrown into different places. So it's kind of tough to figure out how long things actually were. But these judges that we have today were not like the judges back then. And the judge back then, so let's kind of talk about that for a moment. The judges back then were more like rulers. Now the word judge right here is what I think I'd like to call Safat, and I could be wrong. I tried to pronounce it right. And this does mean judge, but it's more closely tied to the word ruler. And so they were, in a way, the judge rulers of that time period. These judges didn't preside in courts. They were in charge. They weren't there to change laws. They were there to make sure that the laws were honored and that they were that people decided that they made sure that people were going to abide by them at least. They enforced the ones that were already in place. They kind of oversaw disputes. Okay. And more importantly, which this is a really important dynamic, is that they were the deliverers or the people or the person who was to make sure that the army was ready to go and was going with the battle and to charge with the army to go out to battle. They were kind of like the military champion of their time period. They would rise up their army to defend Israel or to go against and to go out and conquer a nation that God had asked them to go conquer. And this is more of what they were known for than actually making decisions about the small little, issues that were going on during that time period. This is what the judges were. And now one other small piece of information I'd like to kind of throw out there is that these judges were not the king. Okay? So they weren't like Saul. So we can't look at Saul's time period and David and think, okay, well the judges were kind of like them. They were the king and they were the rulers over all. They made decisions and they changed laws and they decided to do things. No, they were not the king. They were not the ultimate ruler. God was still the ultimate ruler. He was still the king. and that's what they believed. Even though, and we can read throughout the Judges and through a lot of Israel's history, when they chose to do things that they shouldn't do, they chose to worship other idols and sacrifice to idols and kind of go their own way and do evil things, they still had God as their king. God was the king, not these judges. He was the ruler of the Israelites at this point. They had not requested the earthly king at this point, but God was the king. And many of these judges were not only rulers, but they were also prophets at the same time. And so what they would do is they would receive a word from God, and they would tell the people what was going on, or to go out and conquer and to do that battle. A lot of information there, right? And so another interesting fact about judges, which I'm going to throw out there, because we didn't have enough of those, is that these judges and how they came up to be, they weren't passed down from generation to generation to generation. So, for example, if I was, let's say in this place, let's say I was the judge. God's the king, I'm the judge. Kyle would not be the next judge just because he's my son. It wouldn't follow like that, like kings would. Just like how if, when Saul was king, Jonathan was supposed to be the next king because he was the next in line, birthright, right? That's not how these judges came to be about. These judges only came about and kind of got risen up by God. God chose specific people for specific tasks to be the judge. And we can see this in kind of how in how he chose specific people for this specific task. By Deborah was the one who kind of rose up the army. She was the one who kind of did this charismatic thing with the army. We see how God clothed Gideon and literally clothed him with himself, with God all around Gideon, so he could do amazing things. And we also know the story pretty well. I think we all know the story of Samson, how he went out and had this strength beyond strength, this mighty power that God gave him as a judge to do. But this morning we're going to be focusing on Deborah. We're going to be focusing on this one judge, Deborah, this morning. So if you have your Bibles, flip open there really quickly. We're going to be kind of reading in there for a moment. And now remember, these judges were not rulers over a small group of people, of like 5 or 6 people. They were rulers over the entire nation, the tribal confederacy, all the tribes together. They were the judge. They had massive responsibilities. They would serve for a time period, and when either they died or when their time was up, they would stop being the judge. And sometimes time periods went on where there was no judge. The nation didn't need a judge, but then when the nation did need a judge, God would raise up a judge. And that judge would then oversee over the dilemma that was going on at that time period. God would raise them up. So this morning we're going to be focusing on Deborah. We're going to be focusing on this mighty, mighty prophet. And what's kind of interesting this morning is that we're going to be talking about a woman. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not one of those pastors who will say, women who shouldn't be talked about. And the problem is that we don't have a lot of them in the Bible that we know a lot about. We know a lot about Deborah. We know a lot about Mary. We know a lot about a few different characters like Ruth. Naomi. So we do have some, but we just don't have as many as we do men. And so this morning we're going to be talking about Deborah and how she did an amazing, amazing thing and how she was a mighty, mighty judge. So would you stand with me in honor of God's word as we read from Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 10 this morning. My version might be a little different. Apparently, I've been told that I have a weird NIV that's different than a different version of the NIV that I copied online. So it might be a little different, but the message is still the same. Here we go. After Ehud died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, a king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Haragasheth and Haganim, because he had 900 iron chariots and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years after they cried to the Lord for help. It's a long time. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lipihold, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abdon, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go. Take with you 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with the chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Very well," Deborah said, "I will go with you. But because of the way you are going about this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned Zebulun and Naphtali. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. We find the Israelites once again, unfortunately, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, we're not told exactly what evil they were doing, but we were told they were doing evil. And so we know that it's not good. God did not like it, didn't appreciate it, and punished them for it. They didn't just seem to understand that they need to do good in the eyes of the Lord. We kind of see throughout their history that they do things that are evil in the eyes of the Lord. And they come back to him, and then they do evil things. And so God allowed the Canaanites to oppress them for 20 years, which personally I think that's a long time. And when I sat down and I was going through this, I thought to myself, 20 years ago, I was 14. A lot's happened since I was 14. It's a long, long time. Can you imagine being oppressed for 20 years? So go back in your mind, 20 years, whatever that would be for you. Imagine being oppressed for that long. Your country being oppressed for that long. That is a huge amount of time. So God sends a message to his prophet, to the leader, to Deborah, to rise up the army. And they were to get ready to fight against the Canaanites. We have this massive battle that's going to happen. We're getting ready for it. But before they could fight this oppression, they first had to get the army ready. So Deborah calls on Barak to get the army ready and to go to a specific position so that he would be able to take over the army that needed to be taken over, so he could defeat the army. He was going to go with his army, and Deborah was going to kind of do this one thing, and he was going to meet them and defeat the army. And Deborah would then lead a different army, a different campaign against Sisera, and they would win the war. They would win the day, this great plan. And to me, it does sound like a pretty good plan. I kind of like how she sets it up. God says, this is what we're going to do. She says, all right, we're going to do this plan, and we're going to be done with it. And just from reading it, I think it is a good plan. However, Barak has some reservations about it. He isn't very confident like Deborah is in this plan. He agrees to the plan, but he only agrees to it on a condition: that Deborah would go with him. So I wonder, how many of you have been in a position where you're kind of like where either Deborah or Barak are? You say, okay, well, I have this plan, we're going to do this, and then the other person says, well, I'll do it with you, but on one condition, Or you go to someone and they say, yeah, I'll do this with you, but I'm going to only do this with you on one condition. Barak wanted to know that Deborah had his back. And he wanted to know that she was going to back him up no matter what. So how many of you have at least one person in your life who you know has your back? I mean, you just know. You know for a fact this person has my back. Okay, Kyle. Thank you. I appreciate that. Gold star and a piece of candy for you when we get home. Who has your back? What might they have done to deserve this? What are some of the characteristics that this person has, some character traits that they have that you know that they have your back no matter what? I actually I heard a story this week while I was kind of out and about of a young man who was becoming really good at a certain sport. He was coming up and becoming really good at the sport while he was very young. Not very, very young, but kind of in his, early 20s. And he had this thought, I'm getting really good at this sport. I might be able to actually go pro with this thing. I think I might be good enough. And some other people kind of gave him a few compliments saying, yeah, maybe you could. And so he went to his wife and said, would you go with me if I pursued this? And she said, absolutely, of course. I've got your back. I've got your back. His wife had his back. And looking at a different type of relationship that we need to have as a back coverer, how many of you have seen The Office or know of the show called The Office? It's a pretty funny show. Some parts of it are not as funny or kind of messed up, but there's this one scene that I really, really like that we actually watched, I think it was this week. We happened to stumble upon it. And in this show, for those of you who haven't seen The Office, there's this character named Dwight. And now I know when I say the word Dwight, emotions or thoughts immediately creep into your mind. Oh my goodness, this guy or this character, or like you know who this character is. This character is kind of odd, a little weird, I think. Has some strange quirks about him. He had a very unique upbringing. He believes in strength and honor and loyalty. He says a lot of those things, and he is about a lot of those character traits. However, in the series, what's not shown is that he actually cares about his friends. Now, he'll say in the show, I don't care about my coworkers. They're not my friends. He comes out and says that a lot of times. He actually comes out and says in one of the scenes, he would, if he needed to, he'd fire every single one of them just so that the company could save money. But in actuality, he does care about his coworkers. And so in one of the episodes, we have this woman named Pam. She's the receptionist. And she and the salesman named Jim have this wonderful friendship. And they kind of like each other, and then so one person likes one, but one of them's engaged, and they kind of have this back and forth a bunch of times. And so what ends up happening is that Pam is no longer engaged. She realizes that the guy that she was going to marry was not the right person for her. He didn't appreciate her. He didn't love her that much. And she realized that she didn't love him and really loved Jim. The problem right now in the story is that Jim is actually dating someone else. And so because Pam is a wonderful friend, she helps Jim out with his problem in the relationship he has with this woman named Karen. And the next scene, we see Pam sitting quietly by herself, crying, and is just so upset because she knows that she has just helped out her best friend who she wants to be with to go be with someone else because she was being a great friend. And so we have Dwight walking in on the scene, and we would expect, because we know Dwight is kind of harsh, we know that he's rough, that he doesn't really care about his friends or his coworkers, we would expect him to walk in and say something to the effect of, what's wrong with you, or stop crying, or maybe just walk past her and ignore her altogether. But what's really interesting and really fascinating is that Dwight walks in, and the first words that are out of his mouth is, who did this to you? Who did this to you? Because he really cares about Pam and his friendship with Pam and Jim. And even though they have their moments with each other, he cares about her and he has her back. He's upset and wants to know who did this to her so that he can go out and seek vengeance. Now, I'm not promoting vengeance or going out and getting even or anything like that, but he has her back. He has her back. Much in like the church, that we need to have each other's back. And there's so much quiet backstabbing in our world that we can't afford to have that in this place. We can't afford to have that amongst us. However, what ends up happening sometimes is that we have this friendly fire that we have amongst each other. This friendly fire backstabbing where it's almost accepted to have gossip about each other or say things behind each other's backs and to not have each other's backs. So it almost seems to be accepted within the church. We tend to fire on each other, or we might tend to fire on each other when you're down and think, oh, well, I can just hurt this person a little bit more. And it's almost accepted because we do it with a smile on our face and we're not using curse words and really going after someone. A Deborah will always have your back. But we need to be careful and be aware of who you have as your Deborah. One of the people that we can look at is Jesus. And he had 12 disciples. And one of them betrayed him. One of them didn't have his back. Deborah had Barak's back to help him fight the battle, to be there for him, to cover his back. Your Deborah will do the same. Now, with this Deborah, with thinking about this, we often come to the question, does this Deborah have to be near me? Do I need to have this Deborah beside me? This person who we know is our back cover, do they need to be near you? No, they don't necessarily need to be near you. What a Deborah does, what a back cover does, is cover you in prayer. Covers you in prayer. From a short distance, from a far distance, a Deborah will always be there for you and cover you in prayer. One of the amazing parts about having someone who will have your back is that they cover you in prayer, from near and from afar. A Deborah will cover in prayer. Who could pray for you? And you know, sometimes I think we might ask someone, well, can you pray for me? And the quick answer is, oh, sure, and then we might forget about it. You know, and that happens sometimes. And I'm not saying that that's okay, but it's kind of our response that we have. Oh, yeah, I'll cover you. I'll pray for you. And then we might forget about it. Let's try to be intentional about when someone says, can you pray for me? To actually pray for them. And to continue to pray for them and cover them in prayer. A Deborah will cover in prayer. And one of the last elements that a Deborah is and that a Deborah does is it's someone who looks out for people below them. Not to say that the person is mighty and up on high and these people are lowly and worthless, but someone who will look out for the people that are under them. Someone who will not cover up what they did, but cover them and to protect them and help guide them and shape them. This is what a Deborah does, to be there for them. Many of you know that I have two other brothers, Ryan and Michael, and Ryan is 2.5 years younger than me. And when he went off to college, he met me there. When he was a freshman, I was a junior. And on his first day, he showed up white as a ghost. He had his 2 shifts that he had to do in the cafeteria before he even started classes. He came up the stairs to do his first shift, and he was white. As white as this piece of paper. He was white, scared to death, out of his mind. He was so nervous about going to work for the first time, and what to do, and could he handle everything? And I'd already been there for 2 years, been working in the cafeteria for a year and a half, so I took his shifts. I covered him. Now, I did it in the spirit of I would cover him for a week, which turned into a semester, which turned into the year, which I didn't mind. It was okay. I should have known going into it that it could have been a long-term thing. But I covered his back. I had his back. And because of the relationship that I have with him, I'll do that no matter what, even when he does things that are just kind of interesting and that I would think are not the right thing. I'll cover his back. I got his back, no matter what. Another example of this is a growing concern that exists within our church, not this church, but the church in general today. It's a growing concern which was written really well on a website called collegeandseminary.com. If you have a chance, go check them out. They're really good. They had an article on there that someone reposted on Facebook. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about the concern that they have. The concern is really aimed at seniors, youth groups, kind of freshman, sophomore, junior, senior hires in youth group, and college students, and the grave concern that exists for them. And I'm going to read a small portion of that article here. It says, of all the youth group participation variables we've seen being involved in intergenerational worship, that means from kids all the way up through seniors worshiping together, which is good in relationships, there is one variable that most highly correlated to young people's faith. So in other words, while it's great that there are being trained and more called and more specialized paid volunteers and youth leaders, the downside is that the gap is growing bigger and bigger. So in essence, it's great that churches have youth leaders and children's pastors. The problem that exists is that the gap tends to start to get bigger and bigger between the adult church and youth group and children's. It starts to kind of go and grows and grows and grows. And it ends up becoming toxic to young people's faith. As a result, students graduate and all they know is youth ministry and the youth leaders. And that's all they know. They don't know anything else. They don't know anybody else. They don't know their church, and they don't know the adults in their church. It's no wonder they drift away from the church because they feel like they've graduated out of the church. They've graduated out of it. Really good research indicates that almost half of young people drift away from God and the church after they graduate. That hurts. And as a former youth leader, when I read this, going back in my mind of all the teens that we encountered, that's pretty accurate, if not maybe being a little conservative. That hurts. There's this need, there's this dynamic within the church that we need to pay attention to. The church needs to have our kids' backs. We have to engage with them. And something that's really amazing, and I wasn't planning on sharing this, but it just caught my mind, so I want to share it real quick. Something that I really appreciated is when we had our Joyers group, we've been meeting on Wednesdays. We're going to meet this Wednesday, by the way. For those of you who are a part of Joyers or want to be part of it, make sure that you show up 1 o'clock. Hopefully we can still meet this week, I think. And we talked about this dynamic about the adult church and kids and how we need to be more intentional about building relationships with them. And I'm going to put Jan on the spot, if you don't mind, really quickly. Positive things only. And so we had this conversation on a Wednesday, and then I noticed on the next Sunday, Jan really making an effort to engage with Kyle and Luke, to have just the small conversation of, how are you doing today? What a nice shirt you have. Just really starting to engage in that relationship. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. And it really stuck in my mind because that was like 3 months ago. And it was really wonderful to see you do that. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We need to have our kids and teens' backs. We need to partner with parents. I'm going to be a parent of a teenager soon, which, boy, scares the life out of me. The challenges that we're going to face. I know what they're going to be because we're in youth ministry for a long time, but please pray for our teen and our children's parents. We need to partner with them, or what's going to happen is we'll lose them. We're going to lose them. Our teens and kids, you might think, aren't asking questions, aren't trying to figure out who is God. What is this relationship about having this relationship with God? What is this whole dynamic? Why do my parents go to church? They're struggling with these questions. I've had many conversations with every teen that you see that comes through these doors, every kid that comes through these doors, having questions about their faith, trying to figure it out. What does it all mean? We need to partner in relationship with them. We need to have their backs, and more importantly, we need to have their parents' backs. We need to be with them when they ask those tough questions. These questions are good, but we need to have their backs. It's really important that we cover them in prayer. It's really important that we seek to build that relationship with those that are younger. Really important that we cover in prayer as well. So my question, I guess, for you is, who is your Deborah? Who is your back coverer? Or who can you be a back coverer for? Who could you be a Deborah for? To that end, would you pray with me? Father God, this is it can be a very challenging and difficult topic to discuss, because it really, for some of us, will make us step outside of our comfort zone and call us to engage in a relationship that we might not want to engage in or know how to engage in. God, I pray that you would help us to be the back coverers that you need us to be, that you've called us to be. That you would help us to cover each other in prayer. They would help us to find that one relationship that we can intentionally build, that we can intentionally be a back cover for. God, we thank you so much for your word, and thank you so much that it is alive and speaks to us. God, I pray that you would allow this to penetrate our hearts. May your Spirit speak to us this day and the days to come. May we marinate on it and think about it and pray about it. We thank you so much for your amazing love for us. Be with us as we consider these new things. We ask these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen.